Barnes & Noble, please give a warm welcome to New York Times bestselling author Malcolm Gladwell and host of Poured Over, BUNN's Miwa Messer.
I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I'm very happy to see New York in the house today. So we are taping live for the show, so please remember you are going to be on YouTube, you are going to be on all sorts of stuff, and I have all of your questions. But more importantly, we have Malcolm Gladwell with us. And 25 years in, I remember, I was a baby bookseller when Tipping Point came out. I remember that BEA party where you were kind of in the corner going, oh, I have to talk to people. We were nice. We were really nice.
Very nice.
But out of curiosity, I mean, that BEA party must have been 1999, the book pubbed in 2000. And here we are talking about the revenge of the tipping point. How did this book come about?
Well, it was the 25th anniversary, and we thought we would do a kind of revised edition. And then I started doing the revised edition, decided I didn't want to revise the edition.
Right.
I decided to write an entirely new. I thought too much had happened. I was just going to kind of update the original, and then I thought I can't really update it because it's been too long. And now I know why they do sequels in the movies. Right, you do part two right after part one. Otherwise, I guess all the actors die. Is the reason why you don't want to. Well, I sort of felt like I had waited 25 years to do, Revenge of the Jedi.
Okay, I'm a slight bit behind on my Star Wars stuff.
I don't actually know nothing about Star Wars. I was going to do a Godfather reference, but I thought...
Okay, I could have met you somewhere there.
Why not be more...
Okay, but here's a question, though. Why revenge?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, because this time around I'm much more interested in how epidemic principles are used against us, whereas the first time around I was interested in how they're used for us.
Right.
That seemed like revenge to my mind. Someone suggested, I've been doing my book tour and you get all kinds of responses. Someone thought it was because it was my way of saying to critics, I'm still around, which I thought was a very odd interpretation of why you would entitle a book.
I don't see you writing for critics.
No.
I kind of see you writing for yourself first, and the rest of us get to ride along.
I did think it was an odd. Although it did put a little, bee in my bonnet that maybe one day I should just write a book. But I wouldn't call it revenge. I might use more direct language. But that's...
We have to get clever with titles on the shelf when you do that, just so you know. You have to leave vowels out. Out of curiosity, audience, how many of you have read the new book? It's been out for a month. Okay. How many of you have it queued up to go next? Okay. Just so you know, we don't do spoilers in these conversations, so you are safe. How many of you read the original Tipping Point sometime in the last 5 years? Oh, wow. Okay. I figured we had a full house of folks who know Gladwell's work as well as I think you do. But at the same time, you have been just a big piece of bookselling and cultural commentary. I mean, Tipping Point for years and years and years, right, was sort of a niche phrase that applied much more to real estate and racial boundaries within real estate. And then suddenly it becomes kind of like Kleenex, right? Like everyone knows what a tipping point is. And you have become a piece of the lexicon in a way that I'm not sure you were planning on doing when you joined the Washington Post in 1985. Or 86. 85 or 86?
87. Nobody was more surprised than me about what happened with my first book. In my experience, when you set out to deliberately do something like get a phrase in the vernacular, you usually fail. It's not like the thing that people always talk about from Outliers is the 10,000 hours thing, which I thought was... I never imagined that would be. I thought that was the least interesting chapter in the whole book. The difference between a way a writer reads his or her own work and the way readers read it is quite substantial, and it's actually kind of lovely. I like that. I like that it's not my reading that prevails.
You also had a moment talking about Blink where you were like, actually, people have misinterpreted the entire book. It's really not about trusting your gut instinct. It's about how our gut instinct sort of leads us astray. Yeah. I think it's really fascinating.
Well, you have to read to the end.
Yeah, you do, but you may have noticed not everyone does.
Not everyone does. I was interested in this, in the fact that our snap judgments are both extraordinarily useful and also lead us astray,
Right.
overwhelmingly. The same thing that makes an expert is also what is at the foundation of racism, right?
Right.
It's an odd juxtaposition, right? And so the book had to kind of straddle those two. That was what was kind of, to my mind, interesting about writing it. Was it had to? I was making these sort of looking at these two versions of our intuitive judgments. One of which is essential to life,
Right.
and one of which is actually quite problematic.
Okay, I want to go back to that for a second because you just said the same thing that makes you an expert can also shore up the foundations of racism. And I think people in the audience here probably know exactly what you're referring to. But we are going to put this out onto the internets, and there might be people who are not as familiar with that piece of your work. So can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah. So if you watch a great NBA point guard who is making an incredibly sophisticated set of decisions in an instant, right?
Yep.
Sees the court, diagnoses what the correct path for the ball is, sends the ball at on a split second's notice exactly where it needs to be. That is the kind of expertise that has come after, years and years and years and years of training.
Right.
But it's expressed in an instant. He's not thinking through rationally all the possibilities one by one. He's seeing a pattern and reacting in a brilliant way.
Mm-hmm.
But what is racism? Racism is the same thing, but in the hands of someone who is not engaged in a kind of worthy endeavor, but is using the same apparatus, the same powerful, instinctive apparatus to dismiss someone or demean someone or, right? Racism's not considered. I mean, it can be in certain times, but what makes it so visceral and powerful and malignant is that it's instant, right? It's that aversive response. It's that, that flash of emotion. I'm not sending my kid to that school, that kind of thing, which is not like racists don't go home at night and work through their arguments. They don't have arguments, right? It's a response.
Right.
But then, so we have this paradox that we have this equipment inside of us that produces these really powerful responses, and they can be used in a variety of different domains.
In the new book, you open, and I don't think this is giving anything away, but you open with what is clearly a legal backdrop, a legal conversation, and it is someone defending their position in the passive voice. And I raise this because I know this is partially how you got into the material for the new book and realized you had to write an entirely new book, and it comes down to Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
And then we have Medicare fraud in Miami, and we have a rash of bank robberies in Los Angeles. And here we are in this Gladwellian narrative, right, where we get these three very disparate pieces, and you connect them in a way that makes absolute sense because you're poking, as you say, I'm poking at a bear.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't want to poke at a bear? This is
Yeah.
what journalists do. We poke at bears. Booksellers poke at bears a little bit too. But I want to talk about that connection. I mean, its place, its passive voice, its patterns. And we can do this in a way without giving anything up, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so I did. The story that got me in, this book begins very briefly and ends very much with the story of the opioid crisis. Really the story of how OxyContin became this drug that would fuel this extraordinary public health disaster in this country. And the reason I got interested in it is the thing that's weird about the opioid crisis is that it's not everywhere.
Right.
And your instinctive response when you hear about something is an epidemic, is you think, oh, it doesn't respect borders or boundaries. COVID was an epidemic. It was everywhere. There wasn't a country on earth that wasn't touched by COVID. So when we talk about the opioid crisis as an epidemic, we're implying that everywhere in the world there has been this problem with people overdosing on painkillers and narcotics. This is not true. Most countries in the world in fact, many developed countries in the world, countries that we would otherwise think of as being peers of the United States, had virtually no opioid crisis at all.
Right.
Spain, Italy, France. I mean, if you look at their numbers, you can't even, if you make a chart, you can't even see their line. It's so low. It's really just American. And then when you look within America, you see, well, you'd expect then if it was an American problem, it would be everywhere in America. It's not everywhere in America. It's in incredibly specific parts of America. And everyone says, okay, well, I know West Virginia. Well, actually, it's much more puzzling than that. So I'm not going to tell you why now, but read the book. But one of the most striking ones is the comparison of Indiana and Illinois and New York and Massachusetts. Indiana and Illinois are neighbors. They are very, very similar on almost any indice you use. They are equally, equal employment rate, unemployment rates are the same, crime rates are roughly the same. Both have decaying kind of manufacturing. I could go on. They're the same. If you drive from Indiana to across the border, you don't even know you've crossed the border. Indiana had twice the opioid problem that Illinois did, right? So when you see that, and same thing with New York and Massachusetts. Massachusetts got walloped by opioids. New York State did not.
Right.
And when you see that, it demands an explanation, right? It's the whole chapter. When I realized that, that is completely counterintuitive. Like a big chunk of the book is trying to figure out what difference place makes in the path of an epidemic.
Which brings me to Miami.
Yes, I got very interested in Miami.
I had no idea that Miami existed like that.
Yeah.
Medicaid fraud?
Miami is interesting in the same way that Miami is, there's no, well, we know there's no place like it. But if you look at any indice of advanced criminality, Miami is so far off the charts. Minneapolis is here. New York is here. Denver is here. That's Miami. It's like preposterous. And it's not South Florida, it's just Miami. So it's not Boca, it's not Fort Lauderdale. It's like this weird thing, like you cross over, you're going down 995, it says, welcome to Miami, and all of a sudden, you're like in a fraud zone, right? And the question is why?
Right.
It really isn't interesting. So I spent a lot of time tootling around Miami, with various people, trying to figure out what's distinctive about this place. After you read a book, you always have a series of regrets of stuff you should have put in.
Yep.
And I realized in my Miami chapter, what I really should have done is had a whole thing about Miami Vice.
I was wondering about that.
You're wondering why?
Sorry, that might have just been me, but...
For those who are too young, Miami Vice was a incredibly popular television show about two cops set in Miami in the early 80s, two cops who were fighting the drug trade. But the thing that was so hilarious about it, as a way of understanding Miami, it's, I realize now, essential, and I should have just done it about Miami Vice. But the key plot point is that the two cops, Crockett and Tubbs, without explanation, drive Lamborghinis and wear Armani suits.
So much pastel suiting and Lamborghinis.
So you're like, they're cops.
I got nothing.
How are they wearing Armani and driving $200,000 cars? And it's just taken as, that's just the way it is in Miami. That they're so clearly on the take, and you're supposed to love them for being on the take. That's what's kind of fascinating. But that idea, there's actually a whole literature about whether Miami Vice was pivotal in changing the reputation of Miami. Because before Miami Vice, in the 70s, people have forgotten this, nobody went to Miami. It was this ghost town. It was this failing southern city with a massive crime problem, and all the tourist trade had moved north to Fort Lauderdale or Orlando, or south to the Caribbean. Nobody was going to Miami. It was dead. And then Miami doesn't change, but people's willingness to go to Miami changes. And they managed to flip the switch, so they go from a place that's too dangerous to go there to a place that's so dangerous that you want to go there. Right? And Miami Vice is all about that, right? I don't know why I'm talking about Miami Vice, but it's the first television show ever to have as its main character a city and celebrate the city for its violence and dangerousness as opposed to disparaging it. No one had ever done that before. It was brilliant. It's like totally genius.
And it was the 80s too, when, you may remember America in the 80s had its own sort of, that was a moment. But I'm going to bounce us back to Los Angeles and bank robbery. All of this connects, I promise you, all of this connects.
So once you're on to Miami being weird, then you're looking for other weird places. And LA has a bank robbery epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s, and no one else does. In fact, in the early 90s, there's this huge surge in bank robberies, and a quarter of them take place in LA, which is an astonishing. There were 20, in the early 90s, there were roughly 25 or 26 bank robberies a day.
Right.
Which is insane. In fact, I was on my book tour, someone comes up to me and said, "You've totally explained my childhood." She kept getting evacuated from her school because there was a bank branch across the street, and it kept on getting robbed. And the story of LA bank robbery is really hilarious because it features two of the all-time great American bank robbers, Casper and Sea Dog, who are two crack dealers for the Crips in LA, who hear about a bank robbery, and they hear, if your bank gets robbed, the one thing you're never supposed to do is tell anyone how much money was taken, right? And somebody makes a mistake at Wells Fargo in 1989 and informs the press that $500,000 was taken, which is in 1989 is a huge amount of money. So these two crack dealers are like, wait a second, why are we selling crack? There's so much money to be made just knocking off banks. So they become bank robbers, and their great innovation is, remember, early 90s is when all the big corporations were outsourcing. They were doing all their manufacturing overseas because it was cheaper. Casper and Sea Dog decide to outsource their bank robbing, which is a twist that no one had thought of. And so they have kids do their bank robbing, and they recruit kids from high school, and they just wait in a car down the street, and they have a school bus waiting for the kids, and they run out with the cash, and then they just follow the school bus back to their. I mean, they're geniuses. These guys. They just got out actually. But
no, really, they did last year.
They did. No,
Yeah.
we've actually been talking to them.
Oh, good.
At my podcast.
Yes, I
We're
would
very
really like
interested
to hear
in
that interview.
Casper and Sea
I would
Dog.
really like to hear that interview. The larger point, though, is all three of those stories bring us back to
Place.
And
also
how place informs the people and the networks and the spread of contagion.
I just don't. I really, this has been a theme in all of my books. Almost every book I've written has at some point come back to the fact that our environments, our immediate environments, influence our behavior in a way that we're not aware of. That you can't understand anyone without knowing where they're from.
Right.
And I think that's it's one of those things that's both incredibly obvious, but also not in a sort of crucial way. And so this book, I think, perhaps more than any other of my books, I really, 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 really go in depth in trying to understand what is place doing to us. And so I talk about these kinds of narratives that cities or communities have that are really powerful.
So Ryan wants to know what the biggest surprise you had when you were revising the book. So in this case, let's call it rewriting the book.
What was the biggest surprise? Well, the chapter that was most surprising to me I have a chapter on the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And that absolutely everything in that chapter stunned me. I had no idea. It's a chapter, without giving it away, it's all about the fact that people didn't talk about the Holocaust until the 1980s, which I know makes no sense. Really the case that it was absent from, with a handful of very, very small exceptions. I went back and identified what the principal college history textbooks, European history textbooks were in the 1960s and 70s. Ordered those editions and read them to try and find out, okay, is this true? Did no one talk about... If anyone was going to talk about the Holocaust, it would be a history textbook on the Second World War that's this thick, right? You go through there and you get, there has like 2 sentences, or there's a paragraph.
Right.
It's basically, the Germans had created concentration camps for gypsies, communists, and Jews, period, and then they're on to something else.
Right.
It's like not there. And then the chapter's all about how do we rediscover our memories of the Holocaust. But I did that chapter because I was walking, I have this friend named Michael who's has family who were Holocaust survivors, and we were talking about it once, and he had these great aunts, and he's like, but of course they never, ever talked about it. And it's like, you never brought it up with them? No. They never brought it up? No. I was like, that just seemed to be so curious and not what I would have expected. And then I began to realize that was actually the norm.
Reading that chapter made me think of the phrase escape velocity, that you hit a momentum right when an idea is swirling around and swirling around and swirling around, and finally it breaks free and it snaps out, and that's escape velocity. And that's exactly how that chapter felt for me, because I was a student at that point, and I don't remember not knowing about the Holocaust, but I know factually there was a period in my life where I probably didn't.
Yeah.
There's just physically no way that I would have. I want to keep with this surprise thing for a second. We have another question from the audience. In your exploration of hidden forces that shape our lives, which is one surprising insight you think even your most devoted fans might miss? How could recognizing that change the way we see personal or social transformation?
There's always fun stuff in the footnotes.
I love footnotes. Wait, footnote fans? Raise your hands.
Yeah.
Just show yourselves.
Good.
Thank
No,
you.
that's-
Okay, dog ears. Who dog ears their books? Oh, come on. I am not alone in this. All right, I'm alone in this. Fine. Okay.
I'll tell you the story I didn't tell, which I wanted to, but then I was foiled. I have a chapter on COVID, and I went down if you write about COVID, there's always a rabbit hole that you descend, which is once you realize that the virus is airborne, then you realize the quality of the air is the biggest determinant in how much the virus spreads. So then you start getting obsessed with HVAC. Of course you do, right? There was a good month of my life that I'll never get back, where all I did was talk to people about HVAC systems and how well they work. And at one point, the thing you learn is, if you're outside, this is why when you're outside, your odds of you can't really get sick when you're outside. You can't catch COVID. It's really an inside problem, because inside, the air is close enough and whatever that, you're exposed to other people's viral particles. So I got it in my head that, if that's the case, then we should be able to figure out what the safest place to be inside in New York in a pandemic is, right? Sorry, made some calls. And turns out it's the gallery on the 5th floor of MoMA in the David Geffen wing. So I called up MoMA and the press department, and said, my name is Malcolm Gladwell, I'm a reporter. I really want to talk to your HVAC engineers. And they were like, oh my God, in the history of MoMA, I don't think anyone has wanted to talk to their HVAC. They were so happy. And so I went there, and they were like, it was just the best day of my life. They take you, so if you go into MoMA, there's all these floors. I don't know if you've ever noticed, the number of galleries does not match the number of floors, right? So what's on the hidden floors? Office space? No. HVAC. So in the Geffen wing, there's like a really beautiful cafe. So you'll see, if you go to the cafe, you'll see this little side corridor with a security door on the end. If you go down the corridor and you have the special code, you get in, you see, it's like Aladdin's cave. It's like this gigantic room, like double height ceilings, and this row of the fanciest, most extraordinary HVAC machines you've ever seen in your entire life. They showed me their budget. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but literally I'm making this up, but half the budget of MoMA is just HVAC. It is, because if you're lending a painting, if you're lending like a Rembrandt to another art museum, it's like a 50-page contract, and 48 of those pages are about the quality of the air. You don't want your painting to degrade. So they go to these extravagant lengths to make sure the air is perfect. They go, in fact, it's a really good indication of when there's a painting at stake, we will actually go to extraordinary lengths to make sure the painting is healthy. But when there's people, it's less of a pressing issue. But so they have the most insane, fresh air pumped in from the outside, filtered 17 ways. The carbon dioxide levels are record low. The most important thing is the humidity, right? So the virus really likes it when it's dry. Love it right here, right now. You want it to be between 40 and 60% humidity. Now, maintaining that band is takes millions of dollars. They do it all at the MoMA. So if there is not a pandemic, I know where the spot is exactly. And I will post it on my Twitter feed for all of us to congregate there.
Okay.
There's actually, it wasn't even like you should just go to the 5th floor. No. It was way more specific. We got to this special gallery, And they're like, they sort of maneuvered me into the spot. They were like, no, 2 feet over to your left, 6 inches up. There you go. You're safe now from all infection.
Do you remember what the art was hanging on the walls?
I wrote it down. I've forgotten the painting. It's a famous painter.
Okay.
It's not. There's Warhols on that floor, and it's on that gallery. It's not the Warhols. Do not.
All right.
Whatever. Don't risk your life by like hanging out by the Warhols.
Okay, that's good to know. I'm going to combine a couple of questions from the audience because they're basically very similar. Tao and Michael are both sort of looking at how we can use tipping points to make learning more viral, and not just education, but let's use education and sort of a global, more pop culture kind of thing.
One of the principles of epidemic spread that I talk a lot about in this book is the idea of taking super spreaders seriously. That the work in any epidemic is done by an incredibly small group of people who have special powers, as it were. And I suppose that would be the lesson that I would use to think about education, is that I was reading some article in the Wall Street Journal this morning on these 2 British historians who have this podcast, The Rest is History, that is just everyone in the world is listening to it. And the article makes the point that, it's not like history as a subject in universities is thriving right now. It's not. But these 2 guys have managed, and most of their audience is like young people who find what they're talking about really interesting and thrilling. I mean, that's a really good reminder that sometimes we give up on what we think we'll give up on a given task, getting young people interested in history, and we forget, no, it's because it is possible, but it's the only people who are capable of doing it are a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of incredibly skilled operators. Just like the only people who can really spread an epidemic are people who are distinctive in some way. It's not the 95% of us who are implicated in that kind of spread.
So Bianca's going to layer in social media influencers.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to follow it up with media literacy, but that's a whole different thing. In Revenge of the Tipping Point, you explore the darker side of social epidemics and the unintended consequences of tipping points. How do you see today's social media influencers, essentially super spreaders of ideas, contributing to the negative tipping points, and how do you think we can develop a form of social immunity to resist harmful influences?
Yeah. The word social media does not appear in my book. I sort of felt like it's a really important and interesting subject about how social media is fueling epidemics of ideas. I just didn't feel I had anything to add, and I felt like that ground has been covered very brilliantly by other people. And in many ways, the influence of social media influencers it's not mysterious, is it?
No.
So I didn't think the world would profit from another chapter on social media.
But I do think media literacy plays into all of the conversations we're having. And I think having context, right? History is essentially giving ourselves context. And the more you know about global history, the more you know about big moments and little moments. I mean, part of the fun of reading you is when you find that thing. I mean, I'm looking at my notes, and part of my notes includes social contagions, law of the few, the power of context, the stickiness factor. All of that's really important, but listening to you talk about Miami and Medicare fraud and bank robberies in California and the opioid epidemic, that to me is a much more powerful way of telling these stories. But I also do have the context of these places.
Yeah.
I mean, Miami being the context that I had no idea what I was missing about Miami. But Los Angeles, I spent a lot of time in LA, and am I surprised by bank? I am not surprised in the least.
Oh, by the fact that it was the bank robbery capital.
Oh, no, not surprised. I know my people.
Yeah.
But the idea that we still need character, that we still need context, that we need place, that we need a history to understand how we got where we are.
Yeah.
And you have a moment, too, where you're talking about the dude in the Medicaid fraud, the one who looks like Paul Newman. And either his lawyer or the judge in the case says, well, when he left Chicago, Miami changed him.
No, it was his rabbi.
Oh, it's his rabbi.
At his sentencing hearing, he came with
Okay.
his rabbi, and the rabbi said, in defense of him, when he lived in Chicago, he was a nice guy. It's only when he moves to Miami that I think the rabbi wanted Miami to be the one
Wild
with the harsh
West.
sentence. And I think the rabbi was actually right. I think
Okay.
Miami... Look, so here we have a guy. The character in that chapter is this guy named Philip S. Forms, who is this kind of flamboyant, insanely handsome, completely crazy guy racing around Miami in like a $2 million Ferrari. And hilariously, as a side thing, which I don't go into, he has these kids, 2 sons who are very short, and he really wants them to play D1 basketball. And he hires all of these, at great expense, like ex-NBA players to try and train. His son is like 5'6". He's not playing D1 basketball. But you can go on YouTube, you can see this like little kid like running around, like lofting up, layups under the watchful eye of like these 2 6'8" guys who are just out of the NBA. Anyway, the whole thing is like crazy. It's just sort of nuts. But it's so Miami. Like if that guy, he comes from Chicago. If instead of going to Miami, he'd gone to Minneapolis, it doesn't happen.
Right.
It honestly doesn't happen. There's no one like Minneapolis does not encourage that kind of behavior, right? You're not jetting around you couldn't drive a $2 million Ferrari in Minneapolis because if you skid off the road, it's
True.
and there's not like, this guy's, there's something, in other words, he picks up on the kind of narrative of that city in a really kind of, in a very powerful way. It informs his behavior.
Did New York change you, guy from Canada?
Well, I'll deny it.
Go ahead, try.
New York is an interesting case. The question is, so if the phrase I use in the book is overstories. That places have overstories, and the overstories are quite distinctive. And so I mentioned Minneapolis. Minneapolis has an overstory. It is very different from Miami's, right? So the question is, what would New York's be? When you moved to New York as a young person, what are you catching? I don't really know the answer to that. It may be the case that New York is just so many different things that it's the exception to the rule. I don't know. That's an interesting question.
I mean, I came back to New York roughly the same time you did, and it was a very different place. And I kind of miss old, dirty, weird New York. There are times where I'm just like, oh, I can just walk to the grocery store and it's fine.
The one thing that was interesting to me, I really love Atlanta. It's one of my favorite cities.
Wait,
And
why Atlanta?
For many, many reasons, but one of the things I love, it's incredibly beautiful and has some of the greatest neighborhoods in the country. African-American Atlanta feels to me like Jewish New York in this very specific sense. It is when a group that is normally in the minority has numbers, they can express themselves in different ways, and their vibe is different. And so, Jewish culture in New York is unlike Jewish culture almost anywhere else. Yeah. Right? You don't. If you go to Denver, you don't feel the Jewishness of Denver. I mean, this is not part of the makeup of the. And same thing with Atlanta. You feel I find it so insanely refreshing to get a kind of. So that maybe that's part of the New York overstory. I think it is a place that has allowed groups who otherwise would be kind of unheard from to be heard.
Owen's wondering, if you were a young writer entering journalism now, what kind of reporting would you be doing, and what type of media outlet would you be doing it for?
Oh, wow. Well, you can't work for a newspaper. They don't really exist anymore. I think I would, if I was starting out today, the best thing I could tell someone to do is to have some facility with numbers and data. That's obviously going to be a huge part of what journalists do if you think of the combination of, the skillful use of AI to explore, very, very complicated data sets in the course of reporting a story, that to me is a job description of half the profession. The other thing I would do is I would tell them, my great regret is that it took me so long to become an effective interviewer. And I would encourage people to work really, really, really hard on their interviewing skills it is I may never, I was going to say it's a lost art, but I don't know when it was found. It's just really hard to do, and no one does it well. And when someone does it well, the results are so extraordinary that you can be a profoundly different kind of journalist.
Context, you have to walk into the room with context. I'm amazed how many times someone will say, well, I sat down with someone and they hadn't even read my book, but they hadn't even read the coverage or the one sheet that, an associate producer had written, and I'm looking at them going, what?
But I don't, I will disagree with you slightly in the sense that, yes, I do think it's important to be prepared, but preparation, I'm not talking about preparation.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about being able to properly listen to people.
Okay.
Sometimes preparation can get in the way of listening, right? That's why I'm a little bit, even professions, what's amazing to me is if you read through critiques, for example, of medical doctors, there's a huge kind of literature on what a bad job a lot of doctors do in hearing what their patients are telling them. And particularly if the patient is different from them, right? That's the same problem we're talking about. Yeah. But that's a profession where listening to the patient is literally half the job. Right? So if a profession where listening to someone is half the job is bad at listening to someone, then this is a tough one for human beings.
Is that what you learned from your dad? Because your dad would walk up to anyone and ask anything and insisted that he knew everything, knew plenty about math, gardening, and the Bible. And everything else, he was like, I don't know anything. I'm just going to talk to people until I find out more. I mean, is that where this comes from?
Maybe. He had an extraordinary curiosity, but more than that, he was not insecure about admitting when he didn't know something. He just thought it was fine to admit not knowing. I've always wondered, when I watch like a presidential debate, what would happen if one of the candidates, when asked a question, just said, I don't know? And I think it would be really disarming if you said it in the right context. Yeah. If you said, there's an infinite number of things I need to learn. That's not one of them that I've learned yet. Right. And I'm sorry. But I have people that I've deliberately chosen. Blah, you can sort of spin it any way you want to. Right. But just simply saying, as opposed to giving an answer, which so plainly communicates to the audience that you don't know what you're talking about. Why don't you say up front and get it over with? It seems as,
I wouldn't mind. Listen, no one's asked my opinion, though. So, maybe
Frank,
they'll listen to you.
Frank, I have all kinds of ideas for how to improve the presidential selection process.
Is that the next book?
I'm happy to share.
Wait, is that in the next podcast or the next book?
No, I actually should do a podcasting on it.
Yeah.
I've always, for example, why don't you show up to the debate with your vice presidential nominee? If you're going to be a team running the country, why wouldn't you be a team answering questions about it? Why don't we give them problems to solve? They play war game. The military spends an enormous amount of time and effort playing these very elaborate war games where they simulate problems and they have you solve the problem. Why don't we put the candidates in a hotel room for a weekend and have them give them a problem to solve and film the whole thing, and then we'll all watch the film. I think makes.
Can we have the
total
unedited
sense.
version?
I would even rather watch them in some kind of watch them play poker. I would happily, to my mind, if you just see how they handle themselves in a high stakes environment, make them play for real money. We can see their cards and see who can bluff and who can't. See who's an idiot and gets taken in by it's all useful. This is all useful. The idea that the only useful way of gathering information about whether someone is a good president is to ask them questions in a setting where they have to give a really good answer immediately without giving it any time, which is a skill they will never have to use while they're president, right? The whole point of being president is that there's no problem that you solve like that, right? So why are we making them answer questions like that? It's the stupidest thing in the world. It would be like if I was hiring someone to work at my podcast company and I said, well, we only hire people who can run a 6-minute mile, so let's go. What? Everyone looked at me what does that have to do with the job? Exactly. What does that have to do with the job? This is something that we don't seem to have asked ourselves.
Okay. But speaking of your job for a second,
Yeah.
because I'm keeping an eye on the time because we do have a book signing part to get to. Favorite book of yours to write? Asked Chantal.
Well, you know, I know what you're supposed to say, which is you're supposed to say what a parent is supposed to say when asked which of your children is your favorite. You're supposed to say, I love them all equally in different ways.
Okay.
Even though we know you clearly, parents have, I mean, how would they not have favorites? I don't, actually, but I know other parents have favorites.
Lena wants to know what your favorite revisionist history episode is and why. Hers is My Little 100 Million.
Oh, yeah, that was a nice one. Well, there have been so many that were fun for different reasons. Let me think of my top ones. I really liked when we decided there was something wrong with the ending to The Little Mermaid. And we spent 4 episodes fixing it. That was, as someone I worked with told me, she said it was possibly 4 times more episodes on The Little Mermaid than made sense. But it was a pressing problem. If you're familiar with The Little Mermaid, you'll know how deeply problematic it is.
Right.
And how before you watch it with small children, you should really examine your own conscience about whether. And I got into it because I discovered there was a woman who was a lawyer, law professor, whose specialty was contract law, and she was watching it with her kids, and the Little Mermaid story turns on a question of contract law. The Little Mermaid enters into a contract with Ursula to surrender her freedom or her soul or whatever it is if she fails to get the prince to fall in love with her within whatever it is. And as this law professor pointed out to me, that contract would not stand up in any court. It's totally bogus. First of all, she's underage. And secondly, you cannot sign over your soul in perpetuity to a witch. That's not how it works. So she was incensed that her kids were getting a view of American jurisprudence from this show that was at odds with reality. And I remember reading this and thinking, this is just so fantastic. So nothing could be more up my alley than this. So we did 4 episodes. It took us 4 episodes to work through all the problems with The Little Mermaid. I would heartily recommend this to anyone who has that kind of free time.
It seems like a really big investment.
No, it's genius. Because we got, Glenn Close used to live in my apartment building. She had the penthouse. I had the 1 bedroom. But I'd see her in the elevator. So once I got over the fact that she's just so absolutely stunning, once I got past that fact, I actually would chit-chat.
Right.
So I was able to call her years later and say, "It's Malcolm, remember me from the elevator. I need you to play." I think she played she played Ursula. Yes, she played Ursula. And then we got Jodie, because I got Glenn Close, I got Jodie Foster. Because then you can do that, right? You just say, Jodie Foster's people, I got Glenn Close, right? So then you could. So it was star-studded. It was quite extraordinary, this 4-part series. But Disney, sorry, I get very excited about this segment. Disney is famously litigious. They sue everyone at the drop of a hat. So the whole point was that I wanted to get sued by Disney because that would be worth its weight in gold in marketing. That would be the single greatest thing that ever happened in my entire life. If they came after us for $50 million in damages and it's a big splashed across all of the, And so I was I did everything in my power to bring it to their attention, to annoy them, to violate their intellectual property. Nothing. So still angry about that.
I'm so sorry. What role does running play in your creative/writing process?
Well, I think it clears your head. I think running is a lovely. It's like. Although I said this once, I was going to say it's like meditation, and then I once was chatting with this guy who's a big deal in the meditation world, and I said this to him, and a look of just disgust and alarm crossed his face. And I think he was like, "That is insane. There's no way running is anywhere close to meditation as a way of tapping into." So, all right. So it's gets you partially towards the state you get into in meditation, which is useful. it's also fun. I mean,
Lots of different iterations of the same question. How do you keep going? How do you keep finding the passion for what you do? How do you stay engaged? How do you make it all happen?
well, I don't really understand the question. Is the question why I'm not burned out? Is that what
It's
they're
kind of, I
effectively-
mean, no one used the burned out word, but I thought it was kind of fascinating how many people were like, so how do you do it?
Oh, well, I like my job. I work with really fun people now,
Yeah.
and do really the podcast company that I'm a part of is we have all these amazing people who are delightful and full of ideas, and they're all like half my age, so I get to vicariously. If you want to be, I noticed this years ago with all of the sort of successful older people that I knew. They all like ditched friends their old age and got younger friends. And I realized that's exactly what you have to do. You have to. So now I work with people who are like half my age. It's fantastic.
Highly
So-
recommend too. I'm in a similar boat, and it's
Yeah.
delightful. Do it
And I
as
get
much as
to.
you can.
It also allows me in like staff meetings or whatever, I get to play, the eminent screes. Well, you should know, and I tell some story from the '70s. When they were.
Dude, it means we know what Miami Vice is.
Yeah, right. Like, and I always make sure to use references that I know predate them, just so they're reminded of what a graybeard I am.
All right, before I let you go, though, plenty of people have described you in lots of different ways. I want to know how Malcolm Gladwell describes Malcolm Gladwell. Work, life, human, writer, dad, parent. I mean,
Oh,
world-class contrarian is the phrase that keeps getting stuck on you. And I'm like, well, there's a
I'm
little
not
more
that
going on
contrarian.
than that.
Most of my contrarian positions are, in fact, common sense positions that I dress up as contrarian just for
Okay.
fun. The fun is pretending.
Yeah,
I mean, I hate the Ivy League, but everyone hates the Ivy League. But I've made it sound like I'm being a bold warrior. Nothing bold about it at all. I'm like, I'm kicking the thing that everybody kicks.
right.
I think the answer is I enjoy myself.
Okay.
I have 2 daughters, one of whom is very, very serious and has a kind of strong sense of how the world is out to get her,
This is the toddler or the baby?
the baby. And then
Okay.
the toddler just enjoys herself. And I recognize in the toddler
Okay.
a version of myself. She thinks life is fun. And anything, I got this from my dad, who's my father's ability to turn any situation, no matter how unpleasant or perilous, into a good time was unmatched. And my childhood is a series of situations in which he got us into terrible scrapes and pretended that he was in control and knew what was going on, including once, there were so many of them, but he got it in his head. He loved going for walks, but he never bothered to figure out, to look at a map or know. This is before GPS. So we would go on these walks, and then invariably there'd be some catastrophe. So one time, it was in the winter in Canada, and he decided we would walk down a river. And we knew the river ended in this little town called St. Jacobs. And the river was frozen, so we just walk on the frozen river. Super easy. But then he neglected, and he neglected to think about this fact is very telling because he was a mathematician. He reasoned as if the river was straight. But in fact, the river went like this. So we got it's like 20 below, the sun's going down, I'm like 9. I've been on this river for like 5 hours. We're nowhere close to civilization. But I still remember that because I remember my father never once let on that he had screwed up or that we'd been out for 5 hours
Right.
or that it was minus 20. It was just like, this is fantastic.
Right.
We're getting some exercise. And I think that's the key. I recognize in that there's a special kind of genius in that.
And that seems like a really good place to wrap. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Malcolm Gladwell. This is Pour It Over.
Thank you for listening. Pour It Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.